A fragile truce has shattered, reigniting conflict in the Middle East. But the most surprising battle isn't happening on the battlefield. It's brewing, between long-standing allies, threatening to unravel a critical partnership. The war between the US, Israel, and Iran has resumed in recent days. While the Middle East isn't yet fully ablaze as of this recording, the fragile April ceasefire is being severely tested. Over the weekend, Hezbollah launched rockets into Israel, prompting Israel to bomb Beirut in retaliation. This in turn triggered Iran to launch strikes on Israel, which naturally fired back, and the situation escalated rapidly from there. Although it's unclear where things will go next, peace in the Middle East now seems more like an abstract concept than ever before. When we last left off with our update, a ceasefire had just been reached between Israel and Lebanon, having been broken by the United States. Although it was still early, it quickly became clear that, like many other ceasefires in 2026, there was no consensus on its terms. Instead, the entire agreement resembled a house of cards, just one gust of wind away from outright collapse. The ceasefire was supposed to come into effect on or around June 3rd, but in reality, it was more of a slowdown in fighting than anything that could be called a real ceasefire. The issues largely revolved around where the ceasefire was meant to apply. Israel and the Lebanese government both believed Hezbollah would cease fighting, while Israel would merely stop attacking Beirut. Hezbollah, for its part, thought Israel would stop shooting everywhere and withdraw from the country entirely, and only then would they reciprocate. If this sounds like a catastrophe waiting to happen, you wouldn't be wrong. It wasn't exactly a huge surprise when things started to fall apart immediately. So, when it became clear that Israel had no intention of pulling out, Hezbollah publicly stated that the entire process was, and we quote, absurd, humiliating, and insulting. And with that, they immediately resumed firing rockets into northern Israel. Jerusalem, for its part, was still operating in full force in the south of the country. After an IDF soldier was killed in the south by Hezbollah, Israel decided that this whole ceasefire wasn't worth it and struck Beirut itself. That was when the entire Middle East began to ignite. Israeli jets hit what Jerusalem described as Hezbollah command centers in Dahi, Beirut's southern suburbs, without warning. Washington had previously asked Israel to hold off on these strikes, explicitly and emphatically arguing that the Iran negotiations were at a pivotal moment. Washington contended that any solution for Lebanon would emerge from the talks being hosted in the United States. In Iran's view, however, Israel had violated its red line one too many times. Abdulreza Azizi, the spokesperson for Iran's Parliamentary Security and Foreign Policy Committee, posted on X, stating, and we quote, "This rabid dog must be disciplined and put in its place. Watch the sky of the occupied territories tonight." By Sunday, they followed through on their threats. The Islamic Republic fired approximately 10 separate ballistic missiles at Israel, marking the first direct exchange between Iran and Israel since the April ceasefire. Throughout it all, Israel has been adamant that it sees any deal with the Islamic Republic as futile, and has increasingly advocated for a return to hostilities. So these strikes gave Israel what it saw as the perfect opportunity to launch strikes freely, which is exactly what the IDF did. Overnight into Monday morning, dozens of Israeli warplanes crossed into Iranian airspace and hit targets across the country. These included surface-to-missile launchers, camps and stations for the Basij internal paramilitary forces, and raid systems that Tehran had been trying to rebuild since April. Explosions were reported in cities across the country, including Tehran, Isfahan, Tabriz, and Karaj, while a separate strike destroyed the Marun Shah petrochemical complex in Khuzestan. Israel claimed the complex had been feeding material directly into Iran's ballistic missile program. Notably absent from any of this, however, was Washington. Remember that, because we will be coming back to it in just a moment. After Israel's actions, it was Iran's turn, and Iranian forces did not disappoint. They launched Operation Nasser, which means victory in Farsi, and in practice, meant Iran would launch somewhere between 24 and 30 ballistic missiles. Iran claimed direct hits on the Nevatim and Tel Nof air bases, while Israel claims to have intercepted the vast majority of the incoming missiles. As of now, the evidence, at least initially, seems to back up Israel's side. There are no reported fatalities, and just a handful of missile fragments were scattered across northern Israel and near Jericho in the West Bank. For a moment, that actually looked like the end of it. By Monday, the missiles had mostly stopped flying, and Trump was again suggesting that a deal with Iran could be just days away. That April ceasefire, it seemed, might just claw its way back from the dead after all. But if there's anything you've learned from 2026, it's that things are never this simple. On Tuesday afternoon, Donald Trump took to Truth Social, declaring that a U.S. Army Apache helicopter had been downed near the Strait of Hormuz by Iran. Both pilots were rescued from the water unharmed via an unmanned surface vessel, which is, as far as the global public is aware, a reported first for automated combat operations. Politically, this was a very different story, though. After all, per the so-called Rubio Doctrine, only stupid countries don't shoot back when they've been shot at. And sure enough, Trump announced that he must, out of necessity, respond. That retaliation came yesterday evening when, on Trump's orders, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, began what it called proportional self-defense strikes against Iranian targets. According to CENTCOM, the strikes hit Iranian air defenses, radar sites, and ground control stations around the straits, specifically in the coastal town of Sirik and Keshem Island. None of these strikes were tied to oil infrastructure, nuclear sites, or regime leadership. In other words, this was about as limited a response as it could have been, while still involving the bombardment of a sovereign nation. Iran, for its part, hasn't exactly been celebrating America's restraint. In the early hours of Wednesday morning, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps announced a retaliatory drone attack against the U.S. Fifth Fleet stationed in Bahrain. The IRGC threatened further action if American strikes continued. But despite all these fireworks going off across the region, one of the more revealing fights of the week was happening several hundred kilometers away. That fight, surprisingly, has come down to the one between the U.S. and Israel. And while it's being fought with words instead of bombs or drones, it very well might be the most consequential battle we've seen in the last few weeks. Back when Jerusalem and Washington launched this war together on February 28th, they did so on solid footing. Israel might have been a bit more enthusiastic about the whole affair and more willing to pursue the downfall of the Islamic Republic, but by and large the two allies were on the same team. This is nothing new. Trump has consistently been one of the most pro-Israel presidents in American history, and close relationships with Washington have been a key political selling point for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. Increasingly, though, this appears to be under strain for reasons that are largely out of the hands of either leader. As one senior U.S. official put it, Netanyahu needs the war to continue to stay politically alive in Israel, and Trump needs this war to end to stay politically alive in the U.S. We think there's a good deal of truth to this, especially on the Israeli front, where Netanyahu has been under an absolutely brutal series of political attacks from his opponents and allies alike. Former Israeli Prime Minister and leading opposition figure, Naftali Bennett, blasted the Prime Minister for allowing the normalization of attacks from the Islamic Republic on Israel, essentially because Netanyahu backed down when Washington told him to. Bennett was hardly alone. Opposition leader Yair Lapid joined him, and even members of Netanyahu's own party decided that this was simply too much. Moshe Sada, a member of the Knesset, said in an interview with INET, "We should have acted, not now, but 2 weeks ago. We must not contain it. We need to destroy and win." Now, all of this would be pretty tough for Netanyahu under ordinary circumstances. But his problems are made all the greater because his ruling coalition essentially collapsed last month. That coalition depends on several small parties to stay afloat, and one of those small parties decided enough was enough over issues unrelated to Iran. They've decided to throw their hat in the ring for new elections, which are now set to take place later this fall. The entire Knesset will be up for grabs. Trump, for his part, faces a slightly less hostile but still challenging picture in the United States. There, his party is expected to underperform in the fall midterms, with the war's impact on consumer prices and Trump's perceived lack of attention toward domestic issues he promised to address both weighing his party down. Publicly, Trump insists that he couldn't care less about the midterm elections or their eventual result. But his actions in office tell a very different story, and his recent handling of Iran has been no different. In this light, the divergence begins to make more sense, and it creates a regional dynamic that's starting to seem insurmountable. This gives the Islamic Republic a rather unexpected point of leverage. So long as it can continue to bear the pain of Washington's blockade, Iran can continue to strain the alliance by doing next to nothing. Now, we want to be clear. We're not predicting a total divorce between Washington and Jerusalem here, but this rift is real. And until the problem of Iran is somehow solved, it doesn't seem likely to let up. Even in their direct conversations, Trump has been uncharacteristically harsh with Netanyahu. While they were discussing the possibility of an Israeli attack on Iran over the weekend, Trump reportedly told him, quoting, "Bibi, you better be careful, or you will be on your own very soon." And while such a veiled threat is certainly out of the ordinary, it's comparatively tame compared to last week's fiery phone call. That was the one, just in case you missed it, where Trump reportedly lost his temper and told Netanyahu, quote, "You're absolutely crazy. I'm saving your ass. Everybody hates you now. Everybody hates Israel." That tirade, which initially seemed to have been enough to pressure Netanyahu to back down, now appears rather insufficient. According to the Times of Israel, by the time this most recent round of violence quieted down, Netanyahu had already greenlit a substantially larger retaliatory strike on Iran for Monday morning. Fighter jets were reportedly fueled up and on the runway when the stand-down order came through. At least for now, the threat of losing American support seems to be changing Netanyahu's behavior. As he reportedly told his fellow cabinet members, referring to Trump, "Why should we pick a fight with him?" Just how long that influence holds, though, remains to be seen. Ever since Iran and the U.S. struck their original ceasefire back in early April, Lebanon has been a critical and highly problematic part of every conversation about what comes next. And while Lebanon has played a seriously outsized role in all of this, far less attention has been paid in international media to what's actually happening on Lebanese soil, and especially not from a Lebanese perspective. But that perspective is sincerely worth explaining, because it completely upends the conventional narratives being thrown around about the country. For much of the last few weeks, Iran has been increasingly pushing to get Lebanon included in whatever ceasefire it can. Iran wants Israel to pull out of Lebanon entirely and says that an Israeli presence in Lebanon is a red line. Through this lens, it might almost seem like Lebanon and Iran are on the same side, allies even. That simply couldn't be further from the truth, though. Late last week, Lebanese President Joseph sat down with CNN journalist Christiane Amanpour, and when asked about the role of Iran and its urge attempting to negotiate on Lebanon's behalf, he did not mince words, quoting, "It's not your country, it's our country. It's our obligation. It's not your job to interfere in our country. I reject Iran's statement totally, because our people are being killed. Our houses are being destroyed. They are using Lebanon as a bargaining chip." This hardline stance makes a bit more sense once you zoom out and understand the predicament that Lebanon finds itself in. Hezbollah has functioned as a state within a state for decades, and earlier this year, it dragged the country back into war with Israel in defense of its allies in Iran, and the Lebanese government once again just didn't have the strength to stop it. What it does have, though, for the first time in decades, is a government trying to reach some sort of deal to stave this off. President Joseph and Prime Minister Salam have offered Israel direct political negotiations from the earliest days of this conflict, something no prior Lebanese government has really done. Under immense U.S. pressure, Israel eventually agreed, and those talks are set to resume later this month. On paper, the two sides agree on more than you might think. Both are looking for the disarmament of Hezbollah, though that's easier said than done. What's more, the current government in Beirut is likely Jerusalem's best shot at getting anything done. If past Lebanese leadership is any indication, then it may be multiple decades before another Lebanese leader is remotely as willing to cooperate as President Joseph has been. But despite that opportunity, Israel has been making this process even more difficult than it needs to be for the Lebanese government. Israelis have been expanding the territory they've occupied over the last few weeks. That occupation started south of the Litani River, the historical dividing line that usually marks the northward limit of Israeli ground campaigns. But this time, Israel's occupation has continued to move north. The clearest recent example is the city of Tyre. On Tuesday, the IDF ordered the most sweeping evacuation orders for the city so far. These evacuation orders included Al-Harat, the old city's Christian quarter, which had previously been spared throughout the war so far. That relative safety had made Al-Harat a magnet for those who had been forced to evacuate from elsewhere. The neighborhood had taken in hundreds of displaced families from across the south, with Tyre as a whole taking in thousands more from across the south. In a country this small, when over a fifth of the population is displaced, you start running out of places to put everyone. The expanding Israeli evacuations have only exacerbated the issue. All of this makes some of Israel's recent actions all the more counterproductive. Over the weekend, An IDF airstrike just outside Kfar Tianid hit a Lebanese military target, and when we say that, we mean the Lebanese military, not Hezbollah. The blast killed 3 soldiers who had been patrolling the area, including a senior commander, an officer, and a soldier. The IDF claimed that the vehicle had been moving suspiciously and that it was inside of restricted territory that required Israeli permission to be. But the LAF contested that claim. They say that the truck was within normal patrol territory and have condemned what Lebanon described as brutal, deliberate, and repeated aggression. Now, it's not as if Israel has no reason to be concerned about militant activity in this area. Rockets from southern Lebanon have been flying into the country since 2023 and were a looming threat for years before that. Previous Lebanese governments have continuously kicked the can down the road on disarming Hezbollah, which has turned into something of a perennial promise. They've been a year or two away from disarming the group for about a decade. So, Jerusalem isn't exactly buying it when Beirut talks about this time being different. But what makes this all the more dangerous for the Israeli and Lebanese governments alike is the legitimacy, or lack thereof, that Hezbollah enjoys with the broader Lebanese people. A decade or two ago, they were genuinely quite popular. They were seen as a national project fighting for Lebanon against Israel's occupation, in a way that the tired, corrupt, and gridlocked government in Beirut simply couldn't. When Israel withdrew from the country in 2000, it was widely seen as an outright Hezbollah victory. The group had made the region's most powerful army blink, something the Arab states, despite having far more troops and far better equipment, had never managed. In anti-Israel circles in the Arab world, these guys were revered as legends. Fast forward to 2026, and perceptions of Hezbollah have collapsed. That's due in large part to the absolute exhaustion with Hezbollah's provocations against Israel when Israel was not occupying the country. When Hezbollah tried this yet again in early 2026, while everyone was still busy rebuilding from the last war, the country was done. That exhaustion is exactly what produced the most anti-Hezbollah government Lebanon has ever seen, with the president effectively calling them traitors to the country. For Israel, the risks here are twofold. Treat Lebanon like a hostile government, and Israel sends all the wrong signals, advertising to the region that cooperating with Israel gets you nothing. This could risk giving Hezbollah the justification to keep operating well into the future, and potentially with public support. But rely too much on the Lebanese government, and there's a real risk that nothing will get done. Hezbollah will regain strength while Israel is stuck at the negotiating table with a partner that didn't actually matter. And all that leads to the part nobody's talking about. Every week this drags on, that window gets smaller. President Joseph and Prime Ministers Nassalam are spending political capital on pursuing peace with the country tearing Lebanon apart, which doesn't exactly make negotiating with Israel any easier to sell. If this government fails, there isn't another one like it coming along anytime soon.